Hello. In this video, I'm going to talk about the multilingual turn in the field of second language acquisition. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on translanguaging as a theory that has evolved as part of this multilingual turn. So last week, we talked about the social turn in the field of second language acquisition, which has really pushed us to think about the contexts in which children and adults are learning a new language and the identities that they're negotiating in this process. About 10 years ago, our field started a new turn, which has become known as the multilingual turn. And here you see one of the earliest books to call it that, and some of the scholars who have been pushing this work in this direction, which is really to help us to think about deconstructing some of the boundaries that we put around language, deconstructing the idea of language and the idea of bilingualism, and to come to see it as something much more dynamic. So decentering monolingualism as the norm and making bilingual and multilingual practice the center of how we think about second language acquisition and language acquisition in general. And so a big piece of this work has been acknowledging the monolingual bias that has for too long been a part of the field of second language acquisition. Much of the early work in SLA developed from people who were looking at world language students. And so they had a very much a frame of reference of a monolingual person acquiring another language, right? Essentially becoming two monolinguals. And yet we know that's not the reality of the world, right? Francois Grosjean reminds us that more than half of the world's population are bilingual or multilingual. So that isn't the reality of the linguistic world. And yet that is the traditional SLA vocabulary that's used to describe this process. So some of the terms that we've been reading about and using, like native-like proficiency. So what does it mean to be a native speaker? Well, it's a monolingual mindset when we think about a native speaker. Interlanguage, that kind of in-between language that someone develops before they've acquired proficiency or competence. And even the idea of competence, right? What does it mean to be competent in a language? Certainly one is not acquiring every single word that exists in that language. So even thinking about how we decide and measure and frame competence. This idea of fossilization, that at a certain point, a person may remain with some errors in a new language that they have just that have entered into their lexicon and they're not moving forward with, right? But even that is a very monolingual lens on what is happening in that person's mind and in their language production. So again, a big part of this work is acknowledging this bias and then trying to get us to move past it. So one term that has become widely taken up as part of this multilingual turn is translanguaging. It's a term that I myself have spent a lot of time thinking about and researching in classrooms. So what I want to do in this video is give you an overview of what it is, and then also provide you some examples of what it looks like in the classroom. So Ofelia Garcia brought the term translanguaging squarely into U.S. scholarship around bilingualism, bilingual education in the year 2009 in her book, where she took this term that was just kind of coming into our discussions from a Welsh context originally, and then in Colin Baker's work, and she applied it here in the U.S., thinking about bilingual children and the way that we think about the language practices of bilinguals. So she argued, using this metaphor that I think is very helpful, that we often before that time had thought about bilingualism in this way. Bilinguals were either experiencing a subtractive approach where a language was being taken away from them, right? So as they acquire English, maybe they are losing their Spanish. Or we think about it from an additive approach, right? So we are working to support students in becoming balanced bilinguals, two equal wheels on this bicycle. And she argued that that isn't actually what bilingualism looks like, right? People don't become balanced bicycles usually. She argued instead that a more fruitful metaphor for bilingualism is an all-terrain vehicle, which is a vehicle that can adjust to the terrain that it encounters. It moves dynamically in the same way that a person develops their linguistic repertoire in a more dynamic way, right? A more heteroglossic way of thinking about language, because you might develop the ability to write or read or speak in certain ways in a language, depending on the context that you need to use that language for, right? I know from my own experience, I can speak much better in Spanish now than I can write. And that's part of the ways in which that I've had to use the language. I use it much more in speaking than in writing. And that's a very simple definition because I'm just talking about domains. We could get much more specific into context of use and thinking about the language repertoires that are developed and the language features that are developed. But ultimately, it's a way to push back against this idea that a bilingual person is this balanced bicycle, and instead it's thinking about bilingualism in this more dynamic, adjusting to the context in which language features are needed, understanding. And another important point connected to this is that multilinguals always have access to their full linguistic repertoire, and they can use it flexibly and strategically in different contexts. So when our multilingual learners come into the classroom, they're not leaving all of that knowledge behind them, right? They have all of that knowledge with them. It isn't always, they're not always given the opportunity to access that knowledge in meaningful ways, but it comes in with them, right? So it's recognizing that that repertoire is always there. So the way that we think about designing spaces for learning should acknowledge that they have this depth of knowledge of all the language features that they're bringing with them when they come to the task of learning a new language. And translanguaging is sometimes a tricky concept to explain because it really has these three different components. It means three different things. So I'm going to break this down a little bit for you to make sure it's clear. So one is the word translanguaging is a description of how bilingual people language, how they use language. It's also a theory of language, a way that we can think about language. And increasingly, it's been presented as a classroom pedagogy. So let's take a look at each of these components. So first, when we use the word translanguaging, we can be just describing how bilingual people language. Garcia describes it as the flexible and dynamic use of language by and multilingual people, or the everyday way of communicating in bi and multilingual communities. And I have here a few quotes from students that I've overheard when I do research in bilingual classrooms, listening to how students are leveraging the full linguistic repertoire. And students, especially in bilingual learning spaces, translanguage all the time. They're constantly drawing upon language features from every language as a part of their repertoire as they negotiate meaning with one another and with the teacher. So I've heard students say things like, "¿Quién quiere shuffle this deck?" Who wants to shuffle this deck, as they were playing a card game during a math center. So all of the students are emergent bilinguals. Using language in this way makes sense because they're sharing that repertoire, right? Another student in that class, when they were working on a book project, said, "Todos en la escuela son geniuses." Again, using the word geniuses in English here, when he's saying everyone at school is a genius, perhaps to draw emphasis to the word, perhaps not knowing the word, but maybe he did and still wanted to use the word geniuses because it gave it an additional emphasis to the sentence, right? And then this final example is from a kindergartner who came running up to a teacher who is a friend of mine and said, "Fulanita me tago." Was very concerned, and my friend didn't understand what she was saying because me tago is not a verb in Spanish. And after some questioning, she came to realize that the student was saying that another girl, Fulanita, had tagged her, me tago. And so this is a great example of how students not only are drawing from their linguistic repertoire to make meaning, but they also are experimenting with language and creating new language forms as they're doing that. We know people do this monolingually, right? We know that new words are constantly being introduced into the lexicon. I can hardly keep track of all the new words that the next generation has introduced. It happens with bilinguals too, right? Although with bilinguals and multilinguals, it's happening across languages as they're bringing these different features together. And this is one great example of that. So all of these are examples of translanguaging as the practice of bilingual languaging. Now, translanguaging, as we were saying before, is also a linguistic theory, right? So it's also this idea that a bilingual person is not two monolinguals. They're not becoming a balanced bicycle, or what Jim Cummins described as two solitudes, but that they are developing a holistic repertoire of all of the language features that they are learning and using. So it's a different way to think about what the bilingual mind is and is doing. And it's also beyond just being a theory of language, it really is centered on racialized bilingual students and the ways in which their language practices have been perceived and taken up. As Garcia and colleagues explain, translanguaging centers racialized bilingual students' repertoires and lifeways rather than attempting to remediate them. So again, it's a reframing of what it is that they bring into the classrooms. Their repertoires are not seen as a problem, but they're seen as the way that they live their lives, right? Then we're not trying to fix that. We're trying to build upon it and support them and give them more language features that they can draw upon to make meaning. So as this theory has developed, the theory and the name as the practice, translanguaging has become increasingly thought of as a classroom pedagogy. The way that I describe it, and others as well, Garcia, Ibarra Johnson, and Seltzer have a great book on the translanguaging classroom. And the way that they present it, the way that I think about it is it's really the flexible and strategic use of students' linguistic resources in the classroom. So in a translanguaging classroom, the teacher is really thinking about how to draw upon and tap into students' linguistic repertoire all the time, right? How can I make sure that I'm drawing from what my students know linguistically as I'm supporting them and accessing new content and developing new language? So in that way, it's a teaching tool that helps linguistically diverse students make sense of content and develop their language and literacy. And it's also a way of valuing students' cultures, their identities, and their bilingualism. We're not asking them to leave part of themselves at the door, right? We're welcoming their full linguistic selves and finding strategic ways to connect to that in the classroom. So just a few examples of this as we wrap up. So all of these are examples of what translanguaging pedagogy could look like in the classroom. A bilingual turn and talk or a translanguage turn and talk. So strategically pairing students who share a home language or who have similar language features in their repertoire and inviting them to share with a partner in any language. This is great for accessing prior knowledge because when you want students to think about everything they know in a topic, what they know, they might know in a different language, right? Or languages. So allowing them to access what they know and talk through it then gives them a chance to think more deeply about the knowledge they have about a subject and then bring that back to the class. So it's kind of strategic pairing so students can draw upon their linguistic repertoire to make sense of something. Creating bilingual or translanguaged books is another great translanguaging pedagogy. The picture you see here is a bilingual book that I created with the teacher and students in a second grade bilingual classroom where students wrote the text in Spanish and then translated it into English, and they created this wonderful book about their experience at a bilingual school. I've also done this work with kindergarten, first grade, and second grade students in a mainstream English classroom where some of the students only spoke English at home and some spoke other languages. And together that they wrote a text in English with the teacher, and then they had parents help out in translating the text and created a multilingual book that represented all of the languages that students spoke in the room. So again, these types of affirmation activities are so important, and they also help deepen students' metalinguistic awareness or their knowledge of how language works as they look across languages and think about what's similar and different. And finally, cross-linguistic connections, or explicitly helping students to make connections between the languages that they know and they are learning. So you see this math example where the teacher has provided translations for some of the key concepts that they're learning, so students can make those connections and also deepen their understanding of this unit. Now, of course, as I mentioned, translanguaging, these are great examples of translanguaging that center students' linguistic repertoires. The real aim of translanguaging is to move us forward critically as well. So it's important to also think about more critically oriented examples of translanguaging pedagogy that you could bring into your classroom. One example of that is to analyze texts that showcase the translanguaging of different Latinx groups. So I love this book, Octopus Stew, because it is written by an Afro-Latino author and also showcases Afro-Latinos in the book itself. in the images and in the language choices that are used. And if you analyze this text with students, you can pull out when the author is translanguaging and think about why, right? So why does the author, apart from the title, the author never writes octopus stew? He always says pupo guisao. Why would the author call it that? Well, it's a Puerto Rican dish, so it would make sense that the family would use that's the Spanish name for the dish, right? There's terms like abuela instead of abuela that show that this is a nickname that's used in this Puerto Rican family for abuela, right? Or mijo, which is a common way that Latin Americans who speak Spanish bring together mi hijo, my son, right? So there's lots of interesting analysis you can do here that helps push our thinking on what is language, what is Spanish, what is English, how do bilingual families communicate, who are bilinguals, what do they look like? So there's some depth of conversation you can have using a text like this and analyzing the language that's used. And then here's two more examples, again, more critically oriented. A linguistic landscape project is a great way for students to become more aware of languages around them. So this is an example of students walking through their community and documenting the languages that they see. And it's a way to think critically about language and power. Where do they see English? Where do they see languages other than English? Who lives in that community? And what does the linguistic landscape tell you about that community? Do you see them visibly there? Do you not? So you can do this in a community. You can also do this within your own school. I've had teachers do this exercise walking around their school building and thinking about what languages they see and which ones they don't, and how does that intersect with who is in the school building. And you could engage students in that as well. And then finally, this great exercise that my colleague Chris Leiter does, Chris Leader, Bilingualism in the Public Eye, where she has her students look for examples of bilingualism and power and bring it in and discuss it. So she showed this example of Bad Bunny performing at the Grammys. And when he was singing in Spanish, you see the subtitles that were listed, speaking non-English, singing in non-English. And so the discussion questions that they then engaged with were, does this surprise you that the broadcasting transcription doesn't even say that it's Spanish and doesn't provide what he's saying in Spanish or provide a translation in English, that it's just, if it's Spanish, it's not even represented. And do we think that our broadcasting transcription has a responsibility for providing the original language, providing a translation, especially because our world and our entertainment industry is becoming more multilingual and more global. So thinking critically with students about examples that they find in the world around them. So I hope this helps unpack translanguaging a little bit more and give you some ideas for what translanguaging as pedagogy might look like in your own classrooms.